If you've ever partaken in a discussion about games or gaming in general on the internet, then you have undoubtedly come across the term AAA at one point or another. It can be written as 3 capital A's or triple dash capital A, and it can be used to refer to either game titles or even just developers. But what does this term mean exactly? Well, that's not a complicated question, but it is one we think warrants a video of its own, which is why we've made this one. So without any further ado, let's begin. So, let's talk about the etymology here for a second. AAA is not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything like that. The term stems from the American grading system, where an A is the highest score a student can get and an F is the lowest. AAA is just an over-exaggerated way of saying A+. And all it basically implies is that the game was published or is expected to be published by a major publisher. EA, Ubisoft, Sony, Microsoft, and Blizzard would all fall under this category, although there are more major game publishers out there. By extension, this also means that the game in question had a considerable development and marketing budget. Now, what's interesting about this term is that there is nothing you could directly contrast it with that would adhere to the same grading principle. There are no C or double D games, no single A games, nothing of that sort. And there are certainly no F games, at least not in any official capacity. The term double A is sometimes used colloquially by gamers to refer to games that had a substantial development budget, but still weren't published by any major studio. Although we have to emphasize that this isn't an official term by any stretch of the imagination. As things stand, there's only one other official category of games next to AAA, and that's indie games. This term denotes games that were published by the developers independently of any major publisher, hence the name, indie, short for independent. In movie jargon, this would correspond to blockbusters and indie films. These games are usually developed by smaller teams and tend not to have large budgets. One might refer to a game as indie simply if it didn't have an aggressive marketing budget. But even in this case, if the developer was backed and funded by a major publisher, then the game, by definition, is not indie. Now, the important thing to note right away is that this distinction between AAA and indie titles doesn't in any way speak to the game's quality. It only implies the backing of a major publisher or the lack of said backing. With the advent of Kickstarter, we can even omit the budgetary restraints from indie titles. Over the past few years, we've received more high-budget indie games than ever before. Divinity: Original Sin 2 is a prime example of this. The game was funded through Kickstarter, and it met its initial goal of $500,000 within the first day. It went on to make over $2 million through Kickstarter, and if you didn't know any better, you'd think this was a AAA title through and through. These types of games are sometimes called triple-I games. So yeah, the quality and budget are definitely not something we can go by when making the distinction between AAA and indie. They can serve as general guidelines, but not solid rules. Therefore, the presence or absence of a major publisher in the overall equation remains the only tangible differentiator between AAA games and indie games. In any case, we simply must take quality out of the equation. AAA games tend to have absurd budgets, several hundreds of people working on them, and they still flop easily. Perhaps not financially because the marketing can take care of that, but they can flop in other ways. The number of AAA games that have been released over the past few years, only to occupy the collective attention of the internet for a month or two and then be completely forgotten, is astronomical. So why is this? Well, the way we see it, there are 3 underlying reasons for the stagnation and the generally underwhelming reception of many recent AAA titles. First up, there is the fact that big budgets require big profits. No one's going to invest literal millions of dollars in a product if they don't plan on getting that money back and then some. And this leads to many AAA games feeling overly streamlined, which is only natural. The publisher wants and needs the game to be accessible to the widest audience possible. This is also why many games feature the pay-to-win microtransactions and loot boxes. It's hard to imagine a game director who started a project with a distinct artistic vision going, you know what this game needs? Loot boxes. But if that's what the publisher that funds the game demands, then that's what's going to have to be added in. This is why many gamers gravitate towards indie releases, especially in this day and age of Kickstarter-funded games where indie no longer implies a low production value or pixel art at every corner. Secondly, these games generally tend to avoid taking any sorts of risks. If there is a tried and true formula that is guaranteed to bring you those sweet green dollar bills, why risk compromising that with something as unpredictable as innovation? This makes it so that many AAA franchises stick to an existing mold and only introduce new things after the concepts have already been tried out by smaller studios to great success. Which leads us to our third and final point, which is that AAA games tend to get boring very quickly. Because of the lack of innovation and the huge amounts of money involved, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, some publishers have become notorious for basically releasing the same game year after year. Think Assassin's Creed, or worse yet, FIFA. There are obviously some differences between these games beyond just the aesthetic, but in most cases they're very small. The story may be different, but if you've played one Assassin's Creed, pretty much play them all, at least as far as the tropes and mechanics go. It gets repetitive pretty fast and the franchise simply loses some of its luster. Now, we don't want to make it sound like all AAA games are bad. That's definitely not it. We use the Assassin's Creed franchise as an example of a series growing stagnant and repetitive, but there are a lot of great entries in there also. We've even made a whole video on the series where we go over all of the mainline titles and some of the story and mechanical differences between each title, so check it out if you're interested. And if you've played each and every AC game and you love them all, that's great too. We're not telling you how to feel towards gaming companies, but we definitely feel that many of these games, even the best ones among them, could have been better if a bit of risk-taking had been involved in their development. AAA games also have the potential to be some of the very best experiences gaming as a hobby has to offer. Horizon Zero Dawn, the new God of War, and Red Dead Redemption 2 are just some of the newer AAA titles that deserve all the praise they can get. From Software has sacrificed none of their integrity as a developer, even now when their games have become huge AAA behemoths. And Breath of the Wild is one of the all-time best video games ever. There are things that several millions of dollars can do for a game that no passion project could find feasible, and this generally only pans out if the publisher lets the developer do their thing, which isn't what we've been seeing from many publishers recently. Not all, but you know the ones we're talking about. And that about does it for this video. There's not a lot to talk about here really. Not everyone will agree with this definition, but with how blurred the lines are on all other aspects of game development, we feel that the backing of big publishers really is the only tangible difference between AAA titles and indies. But the moral of the story is that you shouldn't judge a game by its identity as a AAA or an indie. Sure, these identities gave you a broad context of what you should expect from the game, but there's so much variety here that such a binary distinction just doesn't do them justice. Regardless, this doesn't mean you won't come across this term at every corner, so it's good to know what it means and what it can mean. A AAA game can be absolutely amazing, a downright train wreck, or anything in between. Same goes for indies, only the expectations tend to be lower from these titles and the prices not as high, so just keep this in mind. In any case, we hope you found this video helpful. If you have, you can help us out by liking it and subscribing to our channel. And if you've got friends who could benefit from this info, help them out by sharing this video, either directly or on social media. Also, if you want to see more videos like this one, we highly recommend clicking on the bell icon so that you'll get notifications whenever a new one gets uploaded. We're constantly working on new content for our fans, so the next one should be right around the corner. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few. And as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.